Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's study in a series of Spiritism viewed through transpersonal psychology. I'm Fabrício Assunção from the Spiritual Society of Bournemouth. These studies are an international collaboration between the Spiritist Society of Bournemouth in England, the Brazilian Spiritist Medical Association, and the Spiritist Institute from the United States of America. Tonight, we welcome Marluce Hans and Claudia Semeghini, who will be leading our study of chapter 5 of the Gospel of Matthew in the Holy Bible, which deals with the sayings of Jesus known as the Beatitudes. The title of their talk is Individuation, Happiness, and Beatitudes. Marluce and Cláudia will be speaking in Portuguese, so we are pleased to welcome again Dr. Dana Sisi, who will be giving us a translation into English. We will have a time for questions and answers, where all questions will be asked through the Zoom chat. Let me introduce you our speakers. Marluce Hans has a postgraduate degree in Jungian clinical psychology. He's a member of the Jungian Institute of Rio Grande do Sul, the Brazilian Jungian Association, and the International Association for Analytical Psychology. Also, she's a member of the Psychology and Spiritism group of the Medical Spiritist Association of Rio Grande do Sul and the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil. Claudia Semeghini has a postgraduate degree in Jungian psychology. She's a certified Jungian analyst, a member of the International Association for Analytical Psychology, the Psychology and Spiritist Group of the Spiritist Medical Association of Brazil, the Department of Analytical Psychology and New Spirituality of the Brazilian Jungian Association, and the Department of Spirituality and Jung Institute of Rio de Janeiro. Claudia is a national and international speaker and is an author of several books. She's also an art therapist. Dr. Dan Assis has a doctorate degree in education. He is the founding member of the Spiritist Institute in the United States of America. He is also an author and gives public talks on spirituality and spiritism in the United States and internationally. Now, I hand it over to our guest speakers for tonight's study on individualization, happiness, and the Beatitudes. Over to you, Marluce, Cláudia, and Dan.
Então, é uma alegria estarmos aqui com vocês nessa noite, né? E a nossa proposta é
It is a pleasure to be here with you this evening.
juntos, né, podermos nos
And our proposals for us together to dive deeper into these great teachings, this great psychologist that we have, that is Jesus Christ. So our idea for tonight is to have this conversation about this concept of individuation that both Jung and Joanna de Angelis expand on, and which we understand as happiness, and the Beatitudes, which are a treaty on happiness. So today we are bringing some reflections.
Uma alegria estar com todos vocês aqui nesta noite.
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here with you tonight. The Beatitudes talk about personal experiences that Jesus had, of his communion with God, his state of connection with the Father, this Father of love that he brought to us. So in many ways, they are a song of love, of compassion that he directed towards us. And to all those who were suffering, who followed him in his walks, who wanted to be with him and to drink from his words. So it is a great pleasure to be here tonight and talk about this, which is a self-portrait of Jesus. And he speaks to us about his heart. And it's very important nowadays for us to listen to his message and that it may take hold in our hearts. So along those lines, for us to dive into this atmosphere that Jesus brings us, we invite you for a brief prayer.
vendo a multidão,
And
subiu ao
Jesus,
monte
seeing the
e
crowd,
assentando-se, aproximaram-se
went up the
dele seus
mountain, sat,
discípulos e
and his
abrindo
disciples
sua
approached,
boca,
and
ensinava.
opening his mouth, he would teach, saying,
Bem-aventurados os pobres de espírito,
Blessed are the
porque
poor in
deles é o reino
spirit,
dos céus.
because theirs is the kingdom of
Bem-aventurados os
heaven.
que choram, porque eles
Blessed
serão
are those who
consolados.
cry, for they shall be comforted.
Bem-aventurados os mansos,
Blessed
porque eles
are the
herdarão a terra.
peace and the meek, for they will inherit the earth.
Bem-aventurados os que têm fome e
Blessed
sede de
are those
justiça,
who thirst and
porque
hunger for
eles serão
justice,
fartos.
because they will be
Bem-aventurados os
satisfied.
misericordiosos,
Blessed
porque
are
eles
those who are
alcançarão a
merciful,
misericórdia.
because they will reach mercy.
Bem-aventurados os puros de coração,
Blessed are
porque
those who are
eles
pure
verão
of heart, because they will see God.
Bem-aventurados os pacificadores,
Blessed are the
porque eles serão
peacemakers,
chamados filhos de Deus.
because they will be called children of
Bem-aventurados os
God.
que sofrem perseguição por
Blessed
causa
are
da
those who
justiça,
are persecuted for
porque
justice,
deles é o reino dos céus.
because theirs is the kingdom of heavens.
Bem-aventurados sois vós, quando
Blessed
vos
are you
humilharem e perseguirem,
when they
e
hurt you and
mentirem,
persecute you,
falarem todo
and
mal
lying,
contra vós,
they say
por
all
minha
kinds of
causa.
evils against you because of
Exultai
me.
e alegrai-vos,
Be
porque
happy and
grande é o
rejoice,
vosso galardão nos céus,
because
porque
great is your
assim
reward in
perseguiram os
heaven,
profetas que vieram antes de nós.
because
Antes de
as
vós.
such also suffer the prophets that came before you.
Vocês
Com isso,
conseguem só perguntar ao pessoal se eles estão conseguindo ver o slide?
We're just making sure that folks can see the slides. Yes, they
Ok,
can.
que bom. Pois não, Marlos?
então, com isso, né, Cláudia, nós podíamos começar trazendo esse conceito de bem-aventurança.
So we may
né?
start
E
with
qual é o
the concept
contexto em
of
que
these blessings,
Jesus
these beatitudes,
traz a
and the
sua
context
mensagem.
in which Jesus brings these
Então,
messages.
a gente pode pensar que quando Jesus vem,
And so we
quem
can
é que
say
eles estavam esperando? Eles estavam esperando um
that when
grande
Jesus comes, who were they
que
expecting? They
tinha,
were
então,
expecting a
toda
great
essa
Messiah.
expectativa, né, de um líder político, né,
And they had all this
de um
expectation of a
líder
political
que
leader,
tomaria o poder, né,
a,
para o povo
a leader who will
judeu.
take the power
E
back to the
Jesus
Jewish
se
people.
apresenta como esse homem simples, com
And
uma
Jesus presents
linguagem extremamente
himself
acessível, né,
as a simple
trazendo
man
uma
with an easy to
mensagem
understand language,
absolutamente
bringing a
inovadora,
message that was
amorosa,
new and
justamente se
loving,
contrapondo a toda aquela expectativa de poder que
being
havia.
a counterpart to
Então,
all the
Jesus
expectation of
traz
power that
uma
was
nova
expected
atmosfera,
of him. And
né,
Jesus brings us a new
que é
atmosphere,
tão profunda e transformadora que até hoje nós
which is
estamos
so deep, so
vivenciando e
profound, and
sentimos isso,
so
né, em nossos corações,
transformative that to this
quando
day
nos
we still
aproximamos,
feel that in our hearts,
né, e desses
and we
ensinamentos
still
que aos poucos
try
nós
to
começamos
understand
a
these
desvendar.
teachings,
E
and that
o
only now we're beginning
conceito
to
de
unveil.
bem-aventurado é
And
conceito
the
que
idea
vem
of these
de ser
beatitudes,
advertido,
of
seja
blessings, of being
feliz. É isso que Jesus vai
happy,
nos falar a cada
and that I think
início
that is
de
what Jesus
bem-aventurança, ele
will
nos traz.
tell us
Sejam
in the
benditos,
beginning of
sejam
every
felizes aqueles
sentence
que...
he
Então,
utters.
ele vai nos adentrando nesse estado de felicidade.
So he comes to
felicidade
us
verdadeira
with
que
this
todos
state
nós
of
buscamos.
plenitude, of true happiness that we
E o
all
contexto,
search
né,
for.
Marlúcio, o contexto que ele traz as bem-aventuranças
And the context in which he
é
brings
contexto
all the
onde ele desce
blessings,
ele
it is a
sai
context in
de
which
momento
he
onde ele estava íntimo
is
com o
exiting a
Pai,
moment
estava
where
nas
he was in
reflexões,
intimacy
ele
with
buscava,
God
ele
in
se
his
afastava da
reflections
multidão e ia encontrar-se com
as
o
he
Pai.
would
Era um
move away
momento de
from the
conexão com o
crowd
Pai.
and
Então,
connect with
quando ele
God.
volta,
And when he
né,
comes
e
back
ele encontra aquela multidão
and he finds that
desejante
crowd
de alívio para os
who
seus
is
sofrimentos,
searching for
ele é
comfort,
inundado num
he
oceano de amor,
comes
num oceano
drenched
de
in an ocean
paz,
of
num
love,
oceano
of
de
peace,
plenitude, depois
of
daquele encontro com
plenitude,
o Pai.
after he
E
had
aí,
that
depois
time
desse
to
encontro
connect
com
with
o
God.
Pai, então
And
ele
after
vem
that,
distribuir para todos
he
aqueles
comes to
que agora estão
distribute
sedentos,
to all
ele vai
those who are
distribuir a
thirsty, waiting for his words.
a
He comes to
paz
share
que ele
the
irradiava, a
love, the
felicidade,
peace, the light, the
a
happiness,
plenitude de
that radiated normally from him, this plenitude that he had while he connected with God. And it is within that context that we are going to find him sitting in that mount upon which all the people were waiting for him, nearing him to feel his wonderful energy. And as he sits down, and what does that mean, this movement of sitting down? It is the moment of settling, of leaving that status that he found himself and coming down to be with that crowd that was so in need of words. So as he comes down from that connection with God to connect with the people, he can then help them ascend to the Father. This is, in a way, reminds me of a movement of children. Children is shorter, and so when we speak from the top, we sometimes don't reach their eyes. We need to lower ourselves, to knee down, to look at their eyes, so that we can be in the same level. And this is what this moment reminds me of, without a doubt. And if we look at the Beatitudes as a treatise on happiness, we will need to understand the concept of happiness. And along those lines, also deal with a very important concept that Joanna de Angelis works on in her psychological series, which is the concept that Jung brings of individuation. And what is individuation? It is a process of psychological development that takes place throughout our lives. That's why we talk about a process of individuation. So it's an archetypical movement. Our psyche has a goal, has a direction. And this individuation process implies that we need to recognize the meaning for our existence and what is the place that we occupy in life. And this presupposes us working in two levels of consciousness. One being a more limited consciousness, which Jung would call the ego, and a higher conscious, a broader one, which he will then call the self. So when we look at the Beatitudes, we will look using this reality between the ego, this more limited consciousness, and the self, this broader, higher consciousness. If we look at the Beatitudes only through the ego's lenses, it will be very hard for us to truly understand those who are, for instance, blessed because they are poor in spirit, because from the ego's perspective, that would not make a lot of sense. So it's important for us to dive in to this idea of individuation, to comprehend what kind of happiness Jesus is talking about. And for us to go there, we need to ask ourselves some questions to help us get closer to the answers we seek. And these questions are, what does the self want from me? What does the immortal spirit have come to realize? How can I serve the self in a relationship, as you said, between the ego and the self? And as we talk to the self, which is the totality of our psyche, but is also the inhabitants of God within us, our immortal spirit. So the self contains a lot of concepts. So how can I serve this self? How can I bring the spirit of totality to my life and to the world around me? how can I concretize this?
alquímico.
How can I bring this or coagulate this as like a chemical term that to make it concrete, to make it palpable, that which we truly desire? So when we think about this work that Marluz was speaking about, to identify the process of an entire life and perhaps many lives, many lives for us to reach a higher level. And when we think about this individual work that we must do, we also think about our contact with the collective. And the collective needs us a lot too.
É interessante esse aspecto, Cláudio, que está
Indeed,
trazendo,
Claudia, it's
porque
very
a
important for us to
individuação,
highlight this which you're
ela
bringing,
não ocorre,
because
ela ocorre na
individuation
relação.
happens in
Quanto mais eu vou
relationships
me
or
aproximar,
through
compreender
relationships.
do que esse
The
self
more
de
I
mim,
approach the
mais eu vou
concept and
entender
understand
o
the
meu
self
lugar
that
no
is within
coletivo.
me, I
Então,
find my
como é
place in the
importante
collective.
esse trabalho,
How
de
important it is,
autoconhecimento, de se
this work
debruçar sobre a
of
nossa
self-knowledge,
realidade
of self-discovery,
interna, de nos aproximarmos cada vez mais
of
dessa
approaching
realidade espiritual,
this
que
spiritual
é uma
reality
compreensão muito mais ampla
that
da
brings us
realidade.
a
E a
vaster
partir,
comprehension
então,
of reality.
desse processo, onde, num primeiro momento, a gente se separa
And so,
da coletividade,
through this
a gente
process
se
in which
encontra
first
e
we detach
volta para a
ourselves from the
coletividade, então,
collective and then return
encontrando o nosso
later,
lugar,
once we find our
nós
place in
começamos a
it,
nos perguntar, mas então,
we
como é
start
que a
to
gente
ask
pode
ourselves,
pensar o que é felicidade?
how can we
Como é que
begin to
cada
think
de
about
nós
what happiness
entende
is?
felicidade?
How does each one of us
Já que a
understand
felicidade,
happiness?
ela parece ser dos grandes
Since
anseios do ser humano.
individuation,
Inclusive,
since
um
happiness seems to be
das
one of our
grandes
greatest desires.
antigas
In
conduzidas
fact,
em
there's
Harvard
one
é
of
sobre a
the oldest
felicidade.
research that we have
Essa
found at
pesquisa
Harvard is
ocorre há
about
mais de
happiness.
80 anos,
And this research has taken place for more than 80 years now and it
com
demonstrates
a mudança das gerações, o que é
how
importante
generations
para cada
understand that
pessoa,
over time and what is important to
Os
people.
filósofos também se ocuparam desse
The
conceito de
philosophers have
felicidade.
also tried to
E um
tackle
dos
this
conceitos de
concept of happiness.
felicidade é eudaimonia, proposta
And one of these
por
concepts is that of
Aristóteles,
eudaimonia,
que seria
a
estar
concept proposed
cheio
by
de
Aristotle,
Então,
which is to be
vejam que do
full
ponto de
of
vista
daemon.
filosófico,
And from a
a
philosophical
felicidade ela
perspective,
é bem
happiness
diferente daquilo que
is
o
very
nosso ego
different
muitas vezes
than that which our
considera
ego
feliz.
sometimes considers as
Nosso
true
ego pode
happiness.
associar
Our ego
felicidade
can associate
com ser
happiness
bem-sucedido,
with being
ter
successful,
prazer na
to
vida,
have
não
pleasures in
ter
life, of
problemas,
not having
não ter
problems,
conflitos.
not having
Enquanto que
conflicts.
eudaimonia é estar cheio de
When the concept of eudaimonia means to be full of daemon, which means full of purpose, to find my daemon, the role that is mine in this life. So it's a very different perspective, isn't it, Claudia? Indeed, it's an inner perspective, not an outer perspective. The outward word offers us many things, but sometimes they are very empty and are things that do not fulfill or satisfy us. And our soul continues to be thirsty for that meaning and purpose. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a future beatitude today. So this happiness that the world offers us is that which causes anxiety, compulsions, sadness, and sometimes many catastrophes and tragedies in our lives. When people are distanced from true purpose and distance from what really means to be happiness. Happiness is a state of spirit, is not something that cannot fulfill our senses so easily. And I recalled in the beginning of all these sentences when Jesus starts by saying, "Blessed are those, happy are those." That is what Jesus wishes that we achieve. This full happiness, this plenitude, this abundant happiness that brings peace and that finds a place within our hearts and not in the outside world full of distractions and illusions that we live in.
E é interessante, né, que Jung
And it's interesting
dizia que o grande
that Jung used to
desafio
say
do ser humano era
that the
encontrar
great
o
challenge of human
sentido da sua
beings
existência.
is to find the
A gente
meaning
tem
of their
acesso
existence.
às cartas que Jung trocava com
We have
colegas,
access to the letters that
pacientes.
Jung wrote to
Isso foi
colleagues, to
publicado
patients,
em 3 volumes aqui no
and this
Brasil,
was
que eu não
published
sei
in
como
3
é a
different
versão
volumes
inglesa.
in Brazil, and I don't
Mas em
know
um
how the
determinado
English version
WhatsApp
is,
que Jung
but
recebe
in
de
one
uma
of those letters
paciente,
that he
essa
receives from
paciente
one of his
descreve assim um
patients,
sofrimento
she
muito grande
describes her
durante quase a vida
suffering
inteira. E
almost
aí
her
Jung
entire life.
responde para essa
And
pessoa
then Jung
dizendo
replies
assim:
to her saying,
e o que aconteceu com você ao longo da tua
and
vida?
what
Por
happened to
que você
you
encontrou
throughout
um
your
sentido para
life?
isso?
Did you find meaning
Então,
for
quando
that?
Jung propõe a
So when
ideia da
Jung proposes
individuação, né,
the
ele
idea, the
está
concept of
falando da gente
individuation,
encontrar o
he
sentido
is
da nossa
dealing with the
existência.
idea
E
or
muitas
talking about
vezes
the
nessa
idea of
caminhada
finding the
nós não
purpose for
vamos
our
ter só
existence.
momentos felizes.
Because
Então,
oftentimes
a
during our
individuação
journey,
não tem
we
esse
won't have
sentido de
only happy
felicidade
moments.
como
So
nós
individuation does not
imaginamos quando
have
nós
a sense of
pensamos, né?
happiness as we
Porque
think
a
of it.
meta da vida, ele vai
Because
dizer,
the
não é a
purpose of life,
felicidade, mas é
the
o
goal of life is not
significado,
happiness,
né?
but it's
Isso
meaning.
é bastante profundo da gente
And that is
entender.
very deep for
Tanto que ele
us to
dizia que,
conquer
como
and
analista,
contemplate.
a função não
And he used
é
to say that as an
tentar
analyst,
retirar o sofrimento dos
his
pacientes,
function, his
mas
role
ao
was not try
contrário,
to
era
lift suffering
ajudar os
from his patients,
pacientes
but
a
instead
poder
it
suportar
was to
e
help
superar
his
os sofrimentos da
patients
vida,
to
porque a
withstand
vida
that
é assim.
suffering and
Então,
overcome the
o
sufferings of
próprio
life,
conceito de
because life is like
individuação
that.
vai trabalhando essa
So the
ideia do
concept of
sentido e o
individuation
propósito.
works on this
E
idea of
aí
purpose
a
and
gente
meaning,
pode realmente começar a entender esse
that which we
profundo
can begin
ensinamento
to
psicológico
understand
que Jesus
this really
traz
deep
nas duas
psychological
últimas
teaching
citações.
that Jesus brings to
É
us
assim
in the
que o
Beatitudes.
sofrimento ele tem um sentido tão
Indeed,
adverso, né,
and
tão
this suffering
equivocado,
can
porque
have such a
sofrer dói,
misunderstood
de
meaning,
fato.
because
A
to
gente
suffer,
todos
of
nós
course, it is
temos nossos
painful.
sofrimentos
We all have our pain or
particulares,
suffering.
mas como você trouxe, há uma meta,
But
há um
as you
sentido,
spoke,
há um
there is a
significado.
purpose, there is
E
a
a vida não
meaning,
é
there
um
is a
sofrimento.
goal,
O
and
sofrimento
life
é
is not
só
suffering.
uma passagem, uma paragem.
Suffering is a temporary
Quando você
phase of
pergunta para
life.
aquelas pessoas
When we
que
ask
passaram uma
people
vida
that
difícil,
went
muitas
through difficult
delas
lives,
não veem sentido, mas
many
outras
people do
veem
not
em que
see
momento
meaning,
elas chegaram.
but
A
others do
maturidade
see in the
psicológica e
maturity that
emocional
they
que elas
reach,
alcançaram
psychologically and
quando
emotionally
elas
speaking,
atravessaram todo esse
when they
percurso da vida.
overcome all this path
Então,
in
o
life.
sofrimento, ele
So
dói,
suffering
mas ele
for
tem
sure hurts,
um sentido e um
but it
significado.
has a purpose and a meaning.
E quando se chega lá na frente, se
When we
entende.
get
Quando um
farther
traz
ahead in
alguém na
life,
nossa visão
sometimes we understand
espiritual,
that when
e é
we
um grande
um,
desafio para todos
broaden our
nós, que
perspective
nós entramos
of
nesse
the world
plano
as immortal
material, muitas
spirits, which
vezes
is
nós
one of our
esquecemos
greatest
que estamos
challenges as we
encarnados,
come
que
into
somos
the
aqui
physical
por
body,
tempo,
we forget
que
that we are
vamos
here
viver uma vida
temporarily and that we are an
passageira,
immortal
mas
spirit and we
vamos
live in the
chegar
here
ali
and
no
now.
sofrimento como um
But when we're able
sentido,
to
como
see
uma
suffering with
verdade,
purpose
como um
and meaning,
aprendizado,
with an
isso
opportunity
é
for learning,
potencializado, porque nós
this
encontramos
allows
um
us to
fim,
better
um
understand
justificativo, né? Um
things
significado.
and the meaning for it all.
Isso nos diz, né, Cláudia, que nós não podemos
And
dar
Claudia, that also
felicidade para
tells
ninguém.
us that we're not
A
able to grant
felicidade,
happiness to
ela vem
anybody
dessa
else.
capacidade que cada um de nós tem
And
de
the happiness
extrair
comes from
daí o
our own
sentido e o
ability to
significado das
extract this meaning
experiências da
and this
vida.
purpose from the
E
experiences that
Joana
life
de
brings to
Ângeles,
us.
no livro
And Joanna de Angelis,
Simplesmente,
in her book, The
ela tem
Conscious Being,
capítulo só sobre a
gives us a
felicidade.
chapter
E ali
just
ela
around
dá uma
happiness.
definição de
And in
felicidade
it,
que é
she
muito
defines
interessante. Ela
happiness that is
diz
very
que a
interesting.
felicidade é
She
a
says
harmonia
that
entre o ego
happiness
e o
is the
ser.
harmony between the ego and
Eu
the
fiquei
self.
refletindo muito sobre
And I have
essa
reflected quite a
proposição
bit
dela, né?
about this
Porque
proposition that
então
she
ela está
brings,
falando
because what
desse
she's
ego, dessa
saying,
nossa
she's
personalidade
talking about
complexa,
our ego, our
com a
personality,
capacidade de suportar,
of having the
de ter
ability to
paciência, de
withstand, to be
escutar o
patient,
que vem, né, da voz
to
do
hear
self, que o self
what
tem
comes from the
dentro, né?
self.
Então, essa harmonia, essas duas instâncias, né,
So these two
podendo cada uma
instances,
se
the ego and the
manifestar,
self,
né,
be able to
de
manifest
uma
each one of
forma
them in different ways.
não contraditória, porque como
Not
você
in a
estava
contradictory
dizendo,
way,
muitos
but
dos
as you were
nossos
saying, Claudia,
nós consideramos sofrimento
a
é
lot
às
of the
vezes a
things that we
visão
consider
limitada
suffering
que o nosso ego tem.
sometimes is
Né?
just
Então,
our
quando
limited
depois de
vision,
Angelis
only the
propõe a
limited vision that our
harmonia
ego
ego e
has.
self como um
But
conceito
when
de
Joanna de
felicidade,
Angelis proposes
ela está
this
trazendo
harmony
para
between
nós
the ego and
felicidade
the self as a
nesse
concept of
sentido
happiness,
mais amplo, né, de
she's also
sentido
bringing
e
happiness as this
significado
broader
de ser.
sense of purpose
E
and
esse
meaning.
ego capaz de acolher isso, então.
And this ego is capable of understanding that.
Sim, você trouxe uma palavra muito forte, que é
And you also
suportar.
brought a very powerful word,
Quanto
which
daquilo que
is
nós
to
precisamos
withstand.
suportar, né?
How
A
often do we need
imagem
to
é
withstand or
projetada para
bear
nós
this pain?
mesmos, né? Mais uma vez revivemos a
So
dolorosa reflexão
once
e a
more,
mensagem de Jesus.
we can think about the painful passage of Jesus in the Calvary
Sua revelação de que a vida
and
é
his
vida.
revelation
Nós
that life goes
tivemos o
on.
símbolo da cruz, o
And we
símbolo da
have the symbol of the
crucificação.
cross, of the
Então, suportar
crucifixion.
é isso, é estar
So to
crucificado.
bear is to be
Então,
crucified.
muitas vezes esse
So
crucificar
many times this
ele não é
crucifixion
entendido quando
is
nós
not
estamos
understood
passando.
while
Mas quando
we're
nós
going through the
podemos olhar
moment.
com um olhar de retrovisor para
But when
trás,
we're able to
nós vamos
look back
entender
and
o que está
reevaluate
acontecendo.
things, we can
E quando
understand
falou
that journey.
agora daquela imagem, daquela poesia de
And
pegar
I
na
remember
areia,
now
quando
that image
o
in that
poeta
beautiful
diz que
saying or
Jesus
poetry
caminhava
of
com uma
steps in
pessoa,
the footsteps in the
e uma
sand,
pessoa diz para
in which
Jesus, em muitos momentos eu
Jesus
vejo
walked
que
with
há dois
somebody on the
lugares,
beach, and the person
dois
says,
olhares.
many times I see that there are
Mas
two set of footprints on the beach, but sometimes only
essa
once. Why have
conexão,
you
essa
abandoned me in
crucificação
that moment?
nossa,
And
da
Jesus
gente
replies,
realmente se
at that point I
suportar,
carried you.
suportar da
And
travessia,
so this
entender que nós
journey
não estamos
has a lot to
sozinhos. É
has a lot to do with
mesmo que a gente
bearing
não tenha olhos
these
para
challenges and
ver, né?
understanding that we are never by ourselves, even if we don't
E
have eyes to
assim,
see and
Marluce,
ears to
acho
listen.
que a gente pode passar para o
And in that
próximo
way,
slide,
Marluz,
que
I
são
think we
as
can move on
bem-aventuranças propriamente
to the
ditas,
next
né?
piece, which
Mas
are the
é bom a
actual
gente, então,
Beatitudes.
perceber que até agora, né,
But it's important for
intrínseco,
us to
sentido e
highlight
significado que Jesus
that
quis
the
trazer
purpose
nessa
and meaning that
bem-aventurança.
Jesus wants to
Ele,
bring
ele, ele pede, então, com essas
is
bem-aventuranças,
special.
que a
Is
gente
that he's
se
asking with these
aproxime do reino de
Beatitudes
Deus,
that we
que a
get
gente
closer
entenda
to the
como
kingdom
ser
of heavens, that we
amansidor,
understand what it is to
misericórdia, que a
console
gente
others,
possa se sentir
mercy,
pleno,
of
e que a
peace,
gente
that we may
entenda que
find
temos aí que nós
plenitude, and
somos
that we may
filhos de Deus.
understand that we are children of
E
God.
aí nós vamos entrando nessas bem-aventuranças, eu vou mudar
So
de
we are going to
slide,
dive into the Beatitudes, and here are the
e
slides.
essa é a primeira nossa, né?
And here's the first one.
Bem-aventurados os pobres de
Blessed
espírito,
are the poor
porque
in
eles são
spirit, for
reis.
theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
É linda essa primeira
And it's a
bem-aventurança dos
beautiful
pobres
one,
de espírito,
the poor in
porque a gente
spirit.
pode pensar essa
And
pobreza
here we can
no
think about
sentido
this
de
poverty
humildade,
in the
né?
terms
Dessa
of humility.
capacidade, pensando nessa relação do ego com o
And
self,
as we
nessa
think about this relationship
individuação,
between
nessa
the ego and the
capacidade do
self in this
ego
process of
de
individuation,
conhecer os
this
seus
capacity of the
limites, né?
ego to
De se
understand its
colocar
limits,
numa postura de abertura para a
to
vida,
place itself
né?
in a
E
position
aqui
that
eu
is
me lembrei
open to
de
life.
Francisco de Assis,
And
né?
here
Tem
I am remembered
um
of Francis of
biógrafo,
Assisi.
o Leonardo Boff, ele é um
There is a
historiador
biographer,
brasileiro,
Leonardo Boff,
teólogo,
a Brazilian
e
theologian,
ele, quando ele fala da
and
pobreza
he
de
talks about
Francisco,
poverty. When he
ele
talks about
fala que
Francis'
Francisco era
poverty,
pobre não
he
só
says that
materialmente,
Francis
que ele
was not
queria
only
se
materially
despojar dos
poor,
bens materiais,
and that he
mas a
wanted to give
pobreza para
away
ele
his
era que
material
Francisco
goods.
queria retirar,
But another
se
poverty
despojar de
is
tudo
that he
aquilo que o
also wanted to
separava do
give
outro.
away that separated him
E eu
from
achei
others.
linda essa definição da
And I
pobreza
found
cristã,
beautiful
né?
this
Então,
definition of poverty that he
bem-aventurados os
gave to
pobres,
Francis.
né?
So blessed are
Aqui a gente
those
retira aquilo que
that
nos
are
separa
able
do
to
outro,
take
nos
away
coloca
that
numa
which
posição de
distances us from
humildade para a
others,
nossa
that
vida,
brings us
né?
in a
Então,
position of humility
e
towards
aquilo
life.
a gente nosso tamanhinho ali.
and for us to have consciousness and conscience of who we are, and as we approach others.
Me faz lembrar das chagas da humanidade.
And this makes me think of the challenges we face in society, the self-centeredness, the egoism, that really make us put some distance between us and others. And I think that it has a lot to do with us. Because whenever we work towards improvement, we don't fear others. We don't close our door to others. Oftentimes, it's not other people's door to them that are closed. Most of the time, it's our own door that is closed to others. And so when you bring that to us, Marluz, so this detachment that you spoke about of those who are poor in spirit, it's also a detachment of this self-closure, of this defensiveness, of this luggage that we bring with ourselves and that we need to detach ourselves from and free ourselves from. Because it's not just physical goods that hold us back. It's the lack of internal stuffing, so to speak, for us to be able to bear all these changes in life, to go through this journey, as we said. So our vices, our bad habits, all those experiences that we bring from past lives that we're now updating, and all this needs to be reviewed so that we may be able to feel poor in spirit, in the sense of open and genuine and fraternal in nature as we meet Jesus. And here, Jesus also introduces this idea of the kingdom of heaven, which he would then tell us that's within us. So it points us to this inner search that asks us to reach that point of meeting ourselves, to find the divine that resides in which one of us. And for that, our ego needs to leave this arrogance, this overbearing pride and transitory values that we often espouse, and to place itself in this humble position to be open to learning, to recognize our limitations. And so I think it's a beautiful way to start with this first beatitude, because Jesus is bringing us the proposal of a different reality, what he calls a kingdom of heaven. Should we go to the second one, Claudia? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. How could we understand that, Claudia? This mourning is this cry that we all have that washes over our souls, but it's also connected to the previous beatitude that talks about detachment. It is a mourning where we recognize our smallness. And it's important for us to recognize our own smallness so that we may find abode in that divine within us that we do not recognize, to give a place for this God, for this divine. So when he says, blessed are those who mourn, those who suffer, those who don't have a voice, those who are not cared for or seen or recognized by others and by themselves. And so it highlights the importance of us to externalize that pain, to recognize who we are. Marluz has told us that Jesus has brought us a Father of love. And if he also brought us the idea of a kingdom of heaven, it's impossible for us to wash our inner place so that we may take abode in that inner kingdom that is within us, a kingdom that reflects the purity and the beauty and the gratitude for life. So this morning is often accompanied by the day-to-day life things. Sometimes we focus on what we don't have, but it's also good for us to focus on that which we have. And that's a challenge for all of us, to find for that which we have, of all the journey we have already walked on, to value that experience, to congratulate ourselves on what we've accomplished, because sometimes it's often hard for us to congratulate ourselves, not in a vanity way, but in a true recognition of our efforts. And that all this has a place. There's a place for recognition for us and for this journey that we have been on. So these happinesses, so to speak, of the world must give way to this feeling of peace, of this relationship with the sacred.
Fiquei profundamente tocada, né, com essa
And I am
imagem
deeply
bíblica
touched
dos que choram,
by this image of
que eu me
that blessed are
conectei,
those who
assim,
mourn,
nós estamos
because I connected
sofrendo, né, gente?
to
Quando
the
a gente tem
idea
esse
that when we are
sentimento de
suffering,
impotência,
when we
de
have
não
the
saber o que
suffering
fazer, e aí
of
a gente
helplessness, of
chora.
not knowing what to do, and we
E
cry.
Jesus diz que a gente vai ser confortado. Então,
And Jesus says that we will be
essa
comforted.
capacidade, assim, da gente fazer contato com a nossa dor,
So it's
com as
this
nossas
ability for us to get in
limitações,
touch with our
né?
pain, with our
Entender que tem
limitations,
coisas que nós não vamos
and to
compreender no
understand
primeiro
that there are
momento,
things
mas
that we
que
may
se a
not
gente
understand in a
entrega,
first glance.
né, para essa instância maior,
But
para essa
if we
instância
surrender
superior, essa
ourselves to
instância que
this
sabe,
greater
aí vai ter um
power,
conforto.
we
Tem
will find
coisas que
comfort in it.
escapam da nossa resolução
There are
através do
things that
ego,
escape
né? E só nos
our
resta
ability to
entender que
solve
não
them
tem
through the
nada.
ego. And all
Então,
we can
é
do
essa
is
maturidade
surrender
de
to
compreender
them. And it's this maturity to
e essa imagem
understand
linda ali, né?
this
De
beautiful
que
image that we
ele
have,
está nos abraçando, né?
that
Dentro
Jesus
desse poema
is
que tu
comforting us,
lembraste, né, Cláudio? E que ele carrega no colo.
and that he can
Então, eu
carry
acho que
us
essa
during the difficult
imagem, assim,
moments,
do
much like the
choro,
poem that you
né?
mentioned
Ela
with the footsteps in the
ela
sand.
mostra a nossa fragilidade
So this
e, ao
morning, this
mesmo
crying talks
tempo,
about our frailty,
Jesus dizendo, olha,
and at
vocês
the
não
same
estão
time,
sozinhos.
Jesus and
Então,
spirituality reminding us that
muitas
we are
vezes
not
nós
alone,
esquecemos, porque
and that we
nós
often
tendemos a
forget
viver numa lógica onde o
because
ego
we
tem que
tend to
decidir
live
tudo,
in a
tem que
world where we
saber
think
tudo,
that the
né?
ego
Ele que
needs to
estabelece as
decide on
metas,
everything,
né?
that
E
needs
nós
to
nos
know everything,
esquecemos
that needs to set
da
all goals,
nossa
and
realidade
we sometimes
espiritual
forget
e
our spiritual
do nosso
reality
próprio processo de individuação também.
and our very
Quantas
own
coisas que às
individuation
vezes o
process.
nosso ego quer e a
How
vida
many
nos
things
mostra
does our
que
ego sometimes
e a gente
want,
só vai entender
but
isso
our
anos
life is
depois,
led
né?
somewhere else, and we only
Quando
understand that years
né,
later,
a gente
that
começa a
that which we
entender,
wanted
depois acaba nos
um,
dando um sentido, né?
is different, and what we
Eu
thought
acho
was a
que dentro
problem ends
dos
up
que
being a
choram também,
positive thing.
Jesus está nos
And
dando uma
so when
instância
we
maior,
sing
assim,
that
né?
the blessed are those who mourn,
Que sustenta esse
Jesus is
trajetório da
giving
nossa
us
vida também.
a perspective that there is a larger perspective at play. I'm also reminded of the word trust, as you're talking about that, Marluz, that there is a trust, that there is someone who will comfort us. And that someone that will trust us can come under different clothing. Sometimes we expect a specific way in which we will be comforted, but this presence may come and manifest in many different ways. It could be a good morning, a smile by somebody else. It is a happy meeting with somebody on the way home. So this comfort can come in many different shapes and forms. And then we moved on to the third beatitude. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Just as we look at this image, we are touched. We almost wish to be this little sheep being held by someone in a tender and caring way. Very happy, feeling very light. And in many ways, that is what we wish, to be peaceful. And how are we? How are we in our journey?
É linda essa imagem mesmo, porque a mansidão, né,
And this image
não
is really beautiful
não é a
because
gente não ter
meekness
conflitos né? Mas
it's
diante
not
do conflito, a
not
gente
having
não ser
conflicts,
tomado
but it
por esse
is
impulso de
not be taken
violência,
by this
né? De
impulse of
reagir
violence and reacting once we are
é uma
faced with
postura
conflict.
interna,
It
né?
is an inner
Mesmo
stance
nas situações mais
that even
difíceis,
in the
a gente
most
buscar
difficult
esse lugar de
situations, we
serenidade,
can
né?
search
Então,
this
é
place
muito
that
bonita
is
essa
serene.
imagem da
So this
mansidão,
overall
né?
image
E
of
justamente
meekness
Jesus
is very
contrapõe
beautiful because
essa
Jesus
imagem que a gente
uses
tem de
that
que
as
nós
a
temos que sempre
counterpoint
reagir,
to the image that
né?
we have
Sempre
always,
reluta,
we always
sempre
have to react.
combater,
We
né?
always have to
Muitas
combat
vezes
life. We always have
nós
to act on
reagimos
things.
violentamente
Many
porque
times
nos
we
sentimos
react violently
ameaçados,
because we
né?
feel
E a
threatened.
mansidão, ela propõe
But meekness,
exatamente uma
however,
postura contrária,
proposes
né? De
a different
confiança, né?
attitude,
De
one of trust,
autoconhecimento,
of
com
self
uma
discovery,
lógica maior
that
que
there is a
rege o
larger
universo. E eu
logic or
posso ficar
reason at
sereno
play that
quando
governs the universe,
usar
and
os
that
recursos que eu
I
tenho,
can
né? Então,
calm
eu
myself and use
entendo
the
que a
resources that I
mansidão
have,
nesse
that I will be
sentido,
okay.
né?
So I
Alguém que se
understood
ergue,
meekness in that
capaz
sense
assim de se manter
of
calmo,
being
né? Hoje a
capable
gente tem
of
nós vivemos
remaining
um momento de
calm.
tanta ansiedade, né? E nós temos
And
tantos
nowadays we live in moments of so
rituais para
much
nos ajudar,
anxiety,
né? Para
and we
chegar nessa
find
mansidão.
ourselves using so many different
Que
rituals
se
to try to
nós
reach that
reagirmos de uma
meekness,
forma violenta,
because every time that we react
impulsiva,
violently
existe
or
uma tendência
impulsively
muito
to
grande
something,
depois de
there
nós
is a
nos
tendency
arrependermos, né?
that we may regret it.
Então, a mansidão como uma postura
So,
interna
meekness
que
as an
Jesus
inner
nos traz,
stance
né?
is what Jesus brings to us.
Importante que você traz, né? E o conflito ele sempre vai existir, né, gente?
And
Porque nós
conflicts
somos
will
seres
always
muito
exist
complexos. Nós
because
estamos
we
aqui
are very
para
complex
resolver
beings,
muitas questões.
and we're
Então,
here
o
to
conflito faz parte da nossa
deal
vida,
with
entendeu?
a
Conflito é
lot
a
of
dúvida,
conflicts.
é isto ou isto.
Conflict is the doubt.
São
Is that,
aquelas
should I do this?
confusões
Should I do
nossas
that?
que nós
Those
atravessamos.
moments
Então, o
of
conflito
confusion
faz
and
parte.
doubt. So conflicts are part
Sabemos que
of
essa
life.
vida não é uma vida de passeios,
And we know
não é uma
that
vida de
we haven't come
diversão,
to
é
this
uma vida de
life to just enjoy
resoluções.
and
Nós
have
vamos
fun.
resolver
It's
situações
about
problemas
resolution,
que nós
about
mesmos
solving
criamos
challenges that
em
we have
nossa
created
vida.
for ourselves in
Então,
the
os conflitos,
previous
eles vão fazer parte
life.
da vida.
And
O
so
que
conflicts are part of life
precisamos é ter essa calma, essa
because we
serenidade, para nós
need to have this
atravessarmos
calm,
aquele
this
momento de
serenity to be able
tempestade,
to
aquele momento de
traverse the
tumultuado,
storm,
aquele momento
the moment of
onde muitas vezes
challenges,
nós achamos que não
those
vamos dar
moments
conta.
in
Muitas
which
vezes
many
nós
times we
nos
think we
entregamos ao
cannot
momento
handle.
da tristeza, né?
And we end up
Então,
surrendering ourselves to like a
essa
sadness.
calmaria interna é algo que
So, this
precisa ser
inner
bastante
calm,
trabalhado, né?
it's something that we
E
need
o
to work
manso,
on quite a
ele
bit.
faz uma oposição grande com o
And the meek
violento, porque o
give us a
violento,
great
ele se
opposition to
mostra muitas
violence
vezes a
because those who are
fragilidade.
violent or
Aquele que
violence
grita,
itself
ele grita porque ele
shows its
acha que ele
frailty.
só vai
Those who yell,
ser
they only
respeitado
yell
pelo
because
grito.
they only
E
think
nós
they will
vamos
be respected
entendendo
through the
como
yelling.
Jesus, com a sua autoridade, com a
And
sua
we'll begin to
paciência,
understand how
ele
Jesus,
chegava e
with
se
all his
colocava.
authority, all
Né?
his meekness,
Então,
he
nós
was able
vemos
to
muitas
make
vezes
his
nós
presence felt.
pensamos, Jesus, a gente sabe
So
aquele
often
episódio, né, dos
we
mercadores
think
no
about
templo
things.
e ele fica
For instance, there's
nervoso,
an
né?
episode of the
Mas ele
merchants
está
in the
mostrando
temple in which
ali uma
Jesus is
forma
furious, but
educativa.
he is showing
Ele não
us
está
in an
mostrando ali
educative
que ele não
way.
é manso. Ele está mostrando uma
He's not showing us
serenidade,
that he's not
como uma
meek. No,
forma
he
correta
is
de ser. E
showing us
muitas
a
vezes
correct
a gente
way of
as
seeing.
pessoas confundem uma forma
And
mais
sometimes people
séria de se
confuse a more
colocar com uma
serious way
forma
of
agressiva.
communicating or
E não
manifesting ourselves
necessariamente
as an
estamos
aggression.
agressivos.
And that is not
A
always the
seriedade
case.
faz parte.
Being
Nós
serious
precisamos ser sérios
is
aqui
part
no
of
ser,
life. We
mas
need to
isso
be
não
serious.
significa que seriedade seja
But that
estar
does not
carrancudo.
mean that
Não,
being
não é
serious is
isso.
to be grumpy,
É mostrar uma seriedade,
is to
mostrar como
show
você se
seriousness,
apresenta diante da
is to
vida.
present
E
oneself
essa
towards life in a serious way.
mansidão de
And
Jesus,
this
que Jesus
meekness
nos
that
fala,
Jesus
ela
talks to us
faz
about,
oposição com essa violência,
it,
com
it
essa
gives us great
agressividade
opposition to
tão
that aggression, that violence that is so
nós
prevalent in
vemos
today's
quantas
world.
pessoas estão
And we can see how many people feel out of control, disorganized, and with so much violence and aggression in their hearts. Oftentimes, we don't even have dialogues anymore. And so Jesus reminds us of that meekness that goes in an opposite direction of that cholera, of that anger, and that makes us suffer by releasing all this adrenaline in our body, which only makes us suffer.
Você quer falar mais alguma coisa, Marluz?
Não, eu acho que nós podemos ir para outra.
And I think that we can go to the next one, Claudia.
Isso.
Yes.
Bem-aventurados os
Blessed
que
are
têm
those
fome e sede de
who
justiça,
hunger and thirst for
porque eles
righteousness,
serão
for they will
fartos.
be filled.
Como é que a gente podia pensar isso?
How could we think about
Fome e
this, Claudia?
sede de justiça.
Hunger and thirst for
Pensando
righteousness and
nessa,
justice.
quando Jesus usa esse termo justiça, né?
When
Esse
Jesus
arquétipo de Deus que
uses
vai
this
reger o
idea
universo,
of
tem
righteousness,
uma
this
lógica, existe a
archetype
justiça
that there is
dos
something that
homens,
governs
né?
the
Existe
universe,
uma
that there is a
justiça
justice of
maior,
men, but there is a higher
às vezes nos
justice
custa compreender.
that sometimes it's
E aí,
hard for us to comprehend.
fiquei pensando nesses que quem tem fome e sede de justiça, essas no
So I was
sentido
thinking
de
that
que
those who
essa
thirst
nossa
and are
sede,
hunger
esse
for
nosso
righteousness, that
desejo
this
de uma
thirst, this
compreensão
desire
maior, né, de
for
uma compreensão
greater
maior da vida,
comprehension
do que rege
of
as
life
coisas.
or what
Muitas
governs
vezes
things.
aqui nós podemos nos sentir
Many times we feel
injustiçados a
injustice.
partir de uma lógica, né, de uma
We
lógica
feel that we
mais
have suffered
limitada
injustices
aqui dessa
because of a
encarnação,
logic that is more rooted in this
desse ego, desse
incarnation
contexto
and
que a
this
gente
ego,
vive.
in this
Mas
context
se a
that we
gente
are
pensar
living
na
in.
justiça como uma lei de
But
Deus
if
que
we
rege
think
o
about
mundo,
justice
o
as a
nosso
law
olhar se
of God that
amplia.
governs the
Então,
universe, our understanding broadens.
essa sede de justiça,
This
esse
thirst for
profundo
righteousness
desejo de compreender
and this
essa
deep
realidade
desire
maior,
to
né,
comprehend this greater
é que
reality, this
sustenta
divine reality that supports and empowers the whole
Lembra também da
universe.
verdade. Justiça como uma verdade.
And
Uma
it
verdade
also reminds me
instalada,
of the truth,
instaurada dentro
a
de
truth
nós.
that is
E entender
installed
que
within
nada
us
nós sabemos e
so that we can
ouvimos muito,
understand
nada é por
that
acaso.
nothing is
Mas muitas
happens by
vezes
chance.
a pessoa se sente injustiçada,
But many times we
prejudicada,
find
está
ourselves
equivocada
as the
no
receivers
sentido
of an
correto do que
injustice.
é a justiça.
That is because we are
A justiça
disconnected from the
é
true meaning of what justice and righteousness
resgate,
are.
né? A justiça
Justice
é
is a rescue,
a
is a
justiça
meeting,
é
a
tornar-se
rendezvous,
uno, né? Então,
is to
essa
fill
sede de
oneself whole.
justiça é
So
a
this
sede de
thirst for
encontrar com Deus
justice
a
is the
verdade.
thirst
Eu
for
sou o
meeting
caminho, a verdade e a
justice.
vida.
As Jesus says, I am the way, the
Precisam
truth, and the
encontrar
life.
essa verdade.
So it's the
E
desire to
hoje eu
meet
fico
this truth.
pensando quanto as pessoas
And
estão
today I
fartas,
think about
porque elas
how
estão fartas do que o
people
mundo
are
oferece.
feeling full,
Elas estão
full of what the world
atravessando
is
até
offering.
situações difíceis de
And in many
saúde, né?
instances, they
Por
even
conta de
go
uma
through many
fartura gigante de
difficult health
alimentos, muitas vezes,
issues because they
então
have so much
alimentos que não
food
nutrem,
of
mas
food that do not
que
nourish
enchem,
that do not nourish
dá a
us. They
existência.
just makes us
Então,
feel full.
essa sede e fome, que
So
não
this
é
thirst and
apagada
hunger
nem pelo
that cannot be
mundo
satiated
material,
by the material
pelos
world,
prazeres, e nem
by the
pela
pleasures of the physical
nutrição
body,
do
or
alimento
by the insufficient
desmesurado.
food
Então, há uma
out of
fome e
control
uma
in our world.
sede. Há
So
um
there is a hunger and
vazio
there's
que
a
precisa ser
thirst.
preenchido.
There's an emptiness that needs to be filled.
Muito bonito isso, né, Cláudio?
And it's very beautiful, right, Claudia?
Também me lembrou, quando tu falaste da verdade, né?
It
Os
also
espíritos dizem,
helped me
né,
recall
no
that when
livro
you're
dos
talking about
espíritos,
truth,
né?
that the
Onde
spirits tells
estão as
us in the
leis de
Spirit's
Deus?
book,
Estão na
they ask us, where
consciência,
are the
né?
laws
Que
of God
consciência
inscribed?
é essa? Essa
And they
consciência do
reply
céu,
that it
do
is in our
espírito.
consciousness
Então,
that
essa
these laws are
fome e
written in.
sede,
Which
né, de
consciousness? The self.
justiça, de
This
verdade,
hunger and
né,
thirst for
também
justice and
é
truth.
uma busca de conexão com esse
It's
aspecto
also a search for
sagrado da
connection
existência.
with the sacred in
E
our
um dos
existence.
aspectos da individuação
And
é
one
a
of the
gente
aspects of
encontrar a
individuation
sacralidade da vida,
is
né?
to
O
find
aspecto
this
sagrado da
sacredness of
existência.
life. of our
onde cada de
existence,
nós tem lugarzinho
where
aqui no universo.
each one of us has a place in the universe, in the collective.
Seria realmente a gente ter esse desejo profundo do ser humano, né?
So really it's about this
De se
profound
encontrar com o
desire
divino
from human
mesmo,
beings
que a
to
nossa
meet
trajetória é essa, né?
the
A gente
divine,
sai
and that's our
inconsciente de Deus
destiny.
e
We
volta para
leave
ele.
God unconsciously and we return to God in a very conscious way.
E aí nós entramos numa próxima
And then we
bem-aventurança.
move to
Bem-aventurados os
our next
misericordiosos,
beatitude.
porque
Blessed
eles
are the
serão
merciful, for they will be
misericordiados.
shown mercy.
Muito linda, né?
And that image is also a very beautiful one
Torna ele saudável.
of a paralytic that is healed by
É
Jesus.
linda essa imagem, né? E a gente associa muitas
It's a very
vezes
beautiful
a
image.
misericórdia a atributo
And we associate
divino,
mercy
né?
as a divine
Porque eu fico
attribute.
pensando, tem filósofo da atualidade
And I think quite a bit about it. There's a
que ele
contemporary
fala da
philosopher, Esponville,
misericórdia
that talks
como
about
algo assim
mercy
que está acima, ele fala de situações tão
as
difíceis
something
muitas vezes de serem
of situations
compreendidas
that
e
are sometimes so
perdoadas,
hard
né?
to be
Que
understood
precisam
and
da
forgiven
misericórdia.
that require
Então,
mercy.
é esse atributo do coração, né?
And it is
Essa lógica
this attribute of the
completamente
heart,
amorosa,
of this very
né? Que não
loving
é intelectual,
reasoning that is
né?
not
E
often
essa
intellectual,
capacidade assim
and this
de
ability
profunda compreensão da
of deep
realidade humana,
comprehension
né?
of
E o
human
quanto todos
reality,
nós estamos conectados nas nossas
and how
dificuldades,
all of
nas
us are connected
nossas
to our
dores, né?
challenges,
Por
of
isso
our
que eu acho que a
pains.
misericórdia ela é
And
atributo
that's why I
bastante
think that mercy
profundo e
is a
talvez
very deep
difícil, né, da gente
concept
compreender
and
muitas
perhaps
vezes,
hard for us to understand at times,
porque ela implica em renunciar ao ódio, renunciar
because he
à
has a lot to do
violência,
about
né, renunciar
renouncing
a tudo,
hatred,
né, nessa compreensão
anger,
maior das
violence,
coisas.
and go towards
Sim,
this
Marluz,
larger
desculpa
comprehension of
te
life.
interromper no final.
Não,
And Marluz, sorry
Eu
for
fico
interrupting
pensando que a
you. And I
misericórdia,
also
ela
think
é
that
tanto
mercy
nossa para o nosso próximo,
is so much
quanto
ours
de
towards
Deus para
others,
nós.
but
Então, são
also
uhum,
God's towards
estágios
us.
muito distantes de misericórdia.
And so we have
Nós
very different
precisamos
phases of
exercer
mercy,
o
but that we need to
exercício
exercise, we need to
de Deus. A gente
practice
precisa, o exercício e o
that,
hábito. Então, nós precisamos
right?
exercer
So we need to
sermos
exercise being
misericordiosos,
merciful,
poder oferecer, poder
to be
dar,
able to offer, to
sem
give
aguardar
that
nada
to
em
others
troca,
without
saber
expecting
perdoar, ser
anything in return.
misericordioso, não julgar. Nós temos o mau
To be
hábito
merciful,
de
to
julgar,
not judge. We have a horrible
de
habit of
olhar
judging
para o
others,
outro sobre a nossa
to
ótica.
look at others
Não é a
with
nossa
our
ótica que
perspective.
vai dizer
It
o
is
que o
not
outro
our
passa,
perspective
o
that will
coração
dictate what others
deles
go
que
through.
vai
It is their
dizer,
heart
é
that
aquilo que
will guide
habita
them.
ali. Então,
It
nós
is
temos
that
o mau
which
hábito
inhabit
de
in
julgar.
them.
Então, o
And so we have the
misericordioso,
habit of
esse
judging
que
others, but the
compadece,
merciful
ele
does
abre a
not
porta,
judge.
como
It is
Marluz fala, abre a
compassionate
porta do
towards
seu
others.
coração e
They
abrirá
open the
outra
hearts of their
para o
hearts
outro
to
precisa.
welcome
E a
others who may need
a
it.
misericórdia de Deus é algo
And
assim
divine
que ele
mercy,
encanta. E muitas
it's something
vezes a
that
pessoa diz misericórdia,
fascinates me,
Senhor, quando há algo
because people say,
muito
mercy, Lord,
dramático e difícil
when there's
que ela
something
precisa
so
viver. Aí,
difficult
às
that they are
vezes,
going
a
through.
pessoa pode pedir quando há um
Many
ente
times people
doente, alguma
may
coisa,
ask for a loved
e
one
pede misericórdia, né?
who is hurt or
Misericórdia,
who is
divina
gravely ill, and they
providência
ask for
deve
mercy.
vir em
And
favorecimento da
divine mercy
cura
can
e do
help with
apaziguamento da
the
vida,
healing
ou até mesmo no descanso.
or even in the
A
rest.
misericórdia de Deus,
Because
ela é
mercy, a
infinita.
divine
Ele
mercy,
sabe
is
aquilo que o
infinite.
nosso coração
And
pede.
God
Então, o
knows
ato
what
de
our
pedir
heart demands.
misericórdia não
So
é muitas
the action
vezes
of
não é
asking for
dizer a Ele
mercy
que nós queremos
is not to
expressar
tell
amor,
God
é
what we
simplesmente
want,
a
because God
conexão
knows.
com o
It's
divino.
simply the
É
connection with the
conectar. E mais
divine.
uma vez a gente fala da conexão
And
com o
one more,
divino.
we talk about
Quando
connection
está
with the divine.
conectando para Ele e de
To connect
fato
with the
nós vamos
divine
até Ele. Quando nós
and
entregamos
to
o nosso
really leads
coração e
us to
depositamos
God when we surrender
nele
our
essa
God, our
dúvida e
heart
essa
to
solicitação de
Him.
misericórdia,
And when we ask for
isso já
this
é
desire
uma sensação de
to have mercy,
bem-estar muito muito grande.
we can already feel wellness.
Nós não podemos.
We ask somebody who can
renunciar,
better
né,
than us.
Cláudia? Misericórdia implica em renunciar à vingança,
And mercy
renunciar ao ódio,
implies in renunciation,
e
of letting go
transformar. Eu me
of
lembrei,
revenge,
estava
of
falando,
hatred, and transformation. And
do
as you were
relato de quando
speaking,
Jesus
I recall
vai
that
resgatar
story
Judas.
of when
Quando
Judas goes to
se
rescue
suicida,
Judas
né, e Jesus
after he commits
vai e
suicide.
resgata ele, né?
And Jesus goes and
Jesus,
rescues him.
naquele momento, não só mostra
And in that
o
moment,
profundo
shows
amor que ele
us
tinha por Judas,
not only a deep love that he had
mas
for
também esse
Judas,
ato de misericórdia.
but also this act of
Então,
mercy.
E isso transformou, foi fundamental, né? Então,
And that was a
muitas
fundamental
vezes
piece
nós
of that experience.
vemos cenas, né?
So many times we
Escutamos
see
coisas e
or
a nossa
hear
tendência natural
scenes, and our
reagir
natural
pedindo
tendency
vingança,
is to
querendo
react
retribuir
demanding
aquele olho por olho,
retribution,
né,
an eye for an
que
eye,
ainda está muito
a
presente
tooth for
no
a
nosso
tooth,
inconsciente coletivo.
that is still very
E
present
aí
in our
Jesus vai
collective
dizer que são
unconscious.
bem-aventurados os misericordiosos.
But instead,
Então,
Jesus says that
propondo uma
blessed are
lógica
those who are
muito
merciful.
diferente do que
And he brings forth
nós
a way of
usualmente
acting, a
estamos
logic that is very
imersos.
different from the ones that we are immersed in.
E aí entramos na próxima bem-aventurança.
And thus we go on to the next one.
Coração.
Blessed are the pure in heart, for
E
they will see
sempre quando
God.
nós falamos dessa bem-aventurança, nós
And whenever we talk about this
imediatamente
particular
vemos a
beatitude,
imagem da criança,
we think about children.
não é, Marluce?
Isn't
A
that so,
imagem da
Marlus?
criança
And the
como
image of
esse
children
olhar, né, sem
with that
preconceito,
eye
né, de uma total
of
abertura,
a total
de
openness,
uma abertura para a vida,
of openness
que
towards life,
propõe estar assim despojado de
that
defesas, né, porque
proposes
no
to
mundo da
be
criança
devoid
tudo é
of
possível.
defense
Isso
mechanisms.
que é
Because in the
interessante.
world of
Se a
children,
gente
everything
der
is
um
possible.
brinquedinho para
If
duas
we
crianças,
give
elas criam um
a
universo
toy
inteiro.
for two children, they will
O
create
mundo
a whole
infantil
universe out of it.
não tem
The
separação,
world of a
tudo é
child
possibilidade.
doesn't have
Então,
separations.
nós vamos
Everything is
perdendo,
possibilities.
né, quando a gente
And with
vai
time, as we grow, sometimes we lose that
amadurecendo e nós
as
vamos
we mature.
recebendo, então, todos esses estímulos do nosso, não só do nosso ambiente
And as we
familiar,
receive
como,
all the
né,
stimuli
né,
from our
da própria
homes, of
sociedade,
life, or
nós
society,
muitas vezes vamos
we often
endurecendo, né, o nosso coração.
become
Nós
hardened in our
vamos nos
hearts.
tornando muito defensivos em
We become more
relação às
defensive
pessoas, à
towards
vida.
people,
Muitas
towards
vezes
life,
defensivos em relação até
and
à
sometimes
divindade,
even
né?
defensive towards the
Então, uma
sacred,
pureza de
divinity.
coração, eu acho que a gente pode pensar como
So the pure in heart, we
essa
can
abertura
here
mesmo,
we can
né, ao
think
que
about
vem do
this
divino,
openness
né, quando
of that which comes
nós
from the
despojamos
divine
dos nossos preconceitos, né,
when we are able to let go of
E
our
aí me lembra da
prejudices.
palavra desapego.
Again, and I am
Quando você
reminded
diz,
of the
vamos
word
endurecendo os corações,
detachment.
pensa
And
no
as you're
vamos
saying,
entulhando o
yes,
coração de
you
coisas que não
said
fazem
as we harden our
sentido.
heart, we start
E
to
vamos entulhando
gather these
coisas,
things in our hearts that don't make
mágoas,
sense. And we
mágoas,
fill our
uma
hearts
mágoa, é
with
uma dor
hurts,
parada, numa
with
emoção que
pains,
cada vez que nós lembramos
and
dela, nós
emotions that
cristalizamos.
when we recall them, we
Então,
crystallize
como
that
nós
negative
vamos
feeling.
entulhando nossos corações,
And how do
os
we
nossos
crowd our
sentimentos?
hearts,
Então, é
our
importante que
inner
a gente se
world with these
desapegue
experiences? So it's important for us to
de tudo
detach
que não
ourselves
tem valor,
from
de
all
tudo
of
que
that,
não
from that which is
importa.
not
Porque quando
really
nós
worthwhile, that
atravessamos
does not
uma
matter.
passagem difícil, nós vamos
Because when we
entendendo o
go
que
through a
realmente
difficult
importa
time,
na vida.
we will really be
Essa
able to understand what
mensagem
really
muito
matters and
feliz.
that which
Então nós
does
vamos
not
nos
make any
desapegando de tudo
difference.
isso e vamos tornando
So
então
to
essa
detach
nossa
oneself
água
from
que
all of
leva
this, and we
uma
will
água mais
transform these
cristalina,
negative
uma água
experiences
que
into
possa
something
refletir
pure,
então
something
Deus
that can
que habita
reflect
em
God
nós. Que bonito
that
quando a gente
inhabits
puder
us.
chegar
How
nesse
wonderful
ponto, né?
it
E
is
em
for us
muitas
to
das
be able
vezes
to
estamos em
reach that
alguns
point.
momentos, quando a gente se aproxima
And
de
in many
alguém,
times we get
e
near
aí a
it
gente pode então
when we
fazer
get close to
refletir esse
someone
Deus,
and we
a gente vai
can
sentir um bem-estar,
have
assim
God
como nós nos
reflected and help
relacionamos,
the other
também
person
sentimos da
feel
mesma
better.
forma.
Much
Então,
the same way
tornar
that
essa
sometimes we
água que nós
approach others and
temos
they help
achado
us feel
ainda mais
well.
pura, para que a gente
So it's to
possa então
change
refletir
that
esse Deus
stuffing
na nossa
within
vida.
us and make it pure so that we can then
Jesus, em
become
outros
better.
momentos, usa a imagem da criança também.
And in many different moments, Jesus also
Então,
uses
o
the image of
resgate
children. So
isso
is this rescuing
que nós fomos perdendo mesmo, né?
of
E
that
de
which we
amanhã
have
vai se
slowly
conectando,
lost over
a gente
time as the
vai
world
sendo
gets
guiado muitas vezes
more complex, and sometimes we're guided by our fear and determine how we relate to life in general.
resgata, então,
And the
esse
child
estado
then
assim, de
rescues
abertura, de
this
disponibilidade,
state
né?
of
E eu me
openness,
lembrei
of
que na
possibilities.
mitologia grega
And I'm
existia
reminded of
deus
Greek
que se chamava
mythology,
Asclepios,
where
que
there is a
é
god called
relacionado ao
Asclepius,
deus da cura, né?
which is
E
connected
no templo
to
de Asclepios, né,
healing.
tinha uma
And the temple of
inscrição na
Asclepius,
entrada do templo de
there was a
Asclepios e
writing in
dizia,
his
né, que
temple
para entrar lá
that used to
deveria
say
ter
that for you
coração
to
puro.
enter, you had to
Eu achei
have
muito
open
interessante
heart,
esse
a pure
processo de
heart.
cura
And
que
I thought that
Asclepios
was very
propõe,
interesting that the
né?
process
Essa
of
cura
healing
para
that
ele
Asclepius
envolvia o
suggests,
corpo e a
that
mente.
healing
Então,
involves the mind and the
no templo de
body,
Asclepios,
and
ele
that
tem
it
vários
requires an
templos,
open heart.
mas no maior templo dele
But
lá
in
em
his
Individuation,
greatest
na
temple
Grécia,
in Greece,
ele tinha assim, as pessoas iam, elas recebiam os
people
chás, né, as
would and
ervas,
take
elas
teas and
elas iam no
herbs.
ginásio para fazer exercícios, tinha a
They would
biblioteca para
exercise. They had a
leitura e tinha um
library for
lugar onde elas
reading,
iam dormir,
but there also
né,
had a
para
place for them to
incubar os
rest,
sonhos, né?
to
Então,
incubate dreams.
para passar por tudo isso, ele
And to
propõe
go
então a
through all of
pureza,
this, he
né, de
proposes this
dizer se
purity in heart,
despojar,
to
né, e estar
detach
entregue,
ourselves
né?
and to
Então essa
surrender to the healing,
disponibilidade, né, que a
this, to
pureza
be
nesse
open and
sentido,
available
não no
to this
sentido
purity,
pejorativo, que muitas vezes
not
a
in a
gente tem,
negative
né,
way
da
that sometimes
ingenuidade assim,
we think, like in an
você foi muito
ingenious way.
ingênuo e foi
Oh, you're
enganado, não é
very
nesse sentido,
naive
né?
and were
É de abertura.
misled. No, not in that sense, but just being open.
E aí, então, nós podemos passar para a próxima, Lana.
And then we can move on to the next
que é
beatitude,
bem-aventurados
which
os
is the one, blessed are the
pacificadores,
peacemakers,
porque
for
eles serão
they
chamados filhos
will
de
be
Deus.
called children of
Então,
God.
depois do coração puro,
So
cada vez
after
mais cristalino,
a pure
menos
heart,
contaminado, né?
a less
Nós podemos,
contaminated
então,
heart,
visitar esse lugar de
then we
pacificadores
can
e sermos chamados
go
filhos
to
de
this place where we
Deus.
can become
Aí eu trago
peacemakers,
aqui
to
três
become children of
frases para a
God.
gente
And I bring here three sentences
considerar.
for us to
Paz na
reflect
terra
on.
aos homens de boa vontade.
Goodwill on earth
Eu
amongst
vos dou
people,
a
men of
paz,
goodwill.
eu vos deixo a
I
minha
have
paz.
give you peace and I
E Salem
give you
Aleichem,
my peace.
que é a
And
paz
Salam
seja
Malek,
convosco.
which is,
Então,
may peace be
visitar
with you.
esses lugares de paz que
So
precisamos
to visit
muito.
these places of
A
peace
principal
is
tarefa
very
do homem
important.
é fazer morada
Our
o
greatest
Deus
purpose
dentro de
is
nós.
to
E
create
para
this
isso ele
shelter for
precisa
God within
estabelecer a
us.
paz
And
em
for that,
nós.
we need to
Sem
establish
guerra,
peace within
nós não
us.
conseguimos esse coração translúcido,
If we
esse
maintain a
estado de
sense of war
pacificação,
within us, we will not be
serenidade.
able to
Quem tem
reach this
paz e sereno,
peacemaking
como diz na luz,
moment.
não teme, se
And if
entrega,
we
confia,
are peaceful,
persevera.
we don't fear,
Ele
we surrender.
não provoca paz, ele provoca o diálogo
And
tão em falta
it goes
na
towards
vida de
dialogue,
hoje o mundo, com bastante
a dialogue that is
bastante
so
guerra.
needed and missing from this world.
Essa paz que nós buscamos, né, que não
So
vem
this
assim
peace is the
fácil,
peace that
né?
we are searching for. It
Muitas
doesn't
vezes
come
ela
easily,
vem após um momento de
and many
muita
times
turbulência,
it comes
muita
after moments of great
tempestade,
turbulence,
muito
of
conflito,
tempest, of
muita
storming,
dor, né?
of
E
pain,
aí
of
sim,
suffering.
quando nós vivenciamos tudo aquilo e
And
entregamos,
when we live through
abrimos
all this and
muito melhor esse
surrender,
lugar de paz.
we then open this
Conhecemos a
peace
paz
place
em
within us,
Deus.
and it can experience that within
E
us.
aqui, né, Cláudia, me chama a atenção que Jesus diz: bem-aventurados os pacificadores.
And here I find very interesting
Então,
that Jesus says the
antes
blessed are
ele
the
diz:
peacemakers.
bem-aventurados os mansos.
Before he
Né?
says,
Então,
blessed are the
a
meek.
mansuetude como uma
So
condição
meekness
interna
is an
nossa.
important and
Mas
eternal
aqui eu já
condition.
começo a
But here
pensar, Cláudia,
I start
na
to think,
nossa
Claudia,
missão no mundo,
about
no
our
nosso
role
indo
in
para
the
o
world,
coletivo, nós indo
our
para o mundo.
our
Né?
individual
Então,
mission towards
nós
the
como
collective, towards the
instrumentos
world,
da paz.
us as
Né?
instruments of
E o próprio
peace,
processo de individuação,
that the
ele vai
process of
propor isso, né? À
individuation
medida que eu
will
vou
bring to us,
encontrando o meu
to the
caminho,
extent
que eu
that
vou
I find
descobrindo
my
o
way,
meu
that I
lugar no mundo, o
discover
tempo
who I
todo ele me
am,
chama.
and find my place in the world, we start to develop this capacity to be instruments of mitigating conflicts, having this ability to not react when faced with a violent moment. And so I think that the Beatitudes that come before this are preparations for us to become peacemakers, for us to be able to be those people that in the moments of deep conflict, we can be the mediators with the people who can listen, who can be peacemakers. So it's this capacity to be able to handle that which is different. It's not running away from it, but to have this ability to navigate things, of not wanting to impose ourselves. And that's why peace is this process of building that has a lot to do with our psychological maturity. A mature ego doesn't have the need to impose itself onto others. And here we go into that logic that we talked about so often, because that young understands this counterbalance between power and love. The peacemakers will work towards love. That love connects. That love is able to build and to arrive at a summary, an understanding that sometimes our intellect cannot. So the peacemakers, they work with the logic of the heart. The differences between us do not matter. It's possible for us to find common ground, a way forward. That's why I think that this beatitude speaks about a psychological maturity that we begin to acquire the more we are connected to the divine.
Sim, uma palavra que me ocorreu foi também o silêncio, o silenciar.
And one word that came to me, Marlus, was also silence. To promote peace oftentimes is to make silence. And to make silence is not to be submissive. It is sometimes not to set things on fire. In some situations, there is not a possibility of doing something else, and silence is important. Because any word that is uttered in some situations may not be understood well. And here we go to one more. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here, when it comes to individuation, we are connecting with this greater sense of self. And in that way, I'm able to bear the challenges. Viktor Frankl used to say that human beings cannot bear life without meaning. We are able to bear persecution in a symbolic way if we are connected with this greater sense of our existence. And it's also our ability for us to deal with contradictions, with the shadow, with criticism. We will not be fully understood by everyone. We will not be unanimously loved. And we shouldn't forget that. And this kingdom of heaven that is within us. So this process of individuation help us understand this sense of solitude, because there is a separation, a distancing from other people or from that crowd that thinks the same way, that behaves in automatic ways, that acts in robotic ways, that seeks for pleasures that no longer make sense to us, who just going through life, the more that we bring these reflections to us, this process of individuation that we spoke to in the beginning, and the Beatitudes, it leads us to a deeper process of individuation. The more we approach that and go deeper into it, we understand that those who persecute us, persecutors between quotes, they are trailing their own journey and we do ours. We cannot please everybody, and sometimes we don't even please ourselves because we have so many complexes and different personalities within us. How could we then please others? So this beatitude speaks a lot about this lonely process that we go through, but that we go through for all this knowledge, the depth, and searching for righteousness. And I remember of that wonderful passage that Jesus says that his yoke is light, is the burden soft. Those who don't make choices are lost. But when we make choices, we strengthen ourselves and continue to follow the ways. It's important for us to understand this price of choice and pay for it. And I think that we can go to the next one and last one.
Das últimas, né?
And here's the ending. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Very profound, isn't it? Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you. And I think, Claudia, this has a lot to do with some of that which you spoke about before. That we have to pay the price for our choices. That when we begin to find our way, we know that there is a price. Everything has a price in life. And I remember that Young, at the end of his life, in a very beautiful moment, he says, in a book called Memories, Reflections, and Dreams, he says, I did everything I could. If I didn't do more, it's because I couldn't. I don't exactly remember his words, but the concept stayed. He paid the price. When we talk about his journey, he was loyal to his path, that which had to do with his daemon. And he lived that in a very correct way within that which was possible to him. So when we arrive at this moment where we must bear our own testimony, give our own testimony, it's important for us to understand that we may not be understood by those around us. They might not comprehend the route or the paths that our soul chooses, but we need to be a bit loyal to our purpose here.
Exatamente. Aqui ele fala muito do suportar, né? Quando
Yep.
falarem
And here
mal
he
contra
talks a
vós
little
por minha
about the
causa.
bearing, right? When
Ele fala
people
realmente desse
falsely say all
testemunho que
kinds
nós
of evil
precisamos
against you,
dar.
of bearing the
Eu lembro
testimony.
sempre, gente, quando eu
And
lembro
I'm
do
always
testemunho, eu me lembro sempre de
reminded
quantas pessoas foram queimadas em
of
fogo,
how many people were
quantos
burned
foram
at the stake,
mortos
how
a
many were
princípios
killed
terríveis,
in these
quantos já
horrible
passaram por
moments of the
tantas
Roman circus
situações
in the beginning, and
terríveis,
how many
perseguições, e eu
have
fico
gone through
pensando,
so
nossa,
many
como deve ser
persecutions. And I
perigoso,
think,
né?
wow, things are a lot
Porque
easier
tem
nowadays,
todos
isn't
esses
it?
animais que nos
We don't
perseguem
face
e eles
all
que nos
these
queimam.
animals
Então,
that eat us
vamos dar
or
esse testemunho, né,
bonfires
para
that burn us.
Jesus,
So
nas
let
nossas
us give our
vidas.
testimony
Cada vez
in
que
our
nós
lives.
pudermos nos modificar,
Whenever
nos
we
transformar,
can to
nós
change and
vamos
transform
fazendo
ourselves,
a vida
let's
de
make
Jesus
it
para nós, a sua
worthwhile to
história,
follow
tudo
Jesus,
isso
to
mostra
honor
o
his
que ele
life
passou.
amongst us and all
E
the
aí eu
teachings he has
lembrei que no
left us with.
final, né, nós trouxemos a oração
And
do
I'm
Paulo,
recalled
né,
that we also brought the prayer of good humor. And we are now facing a moment where the Pope Francis I has just discarnated, and he used to say that every morning he would pray this prayer. And this prayer brings us many different things. It also touches a lot of different things. And I wanted to bring the last part of that. It says, give me, Lord, a good sense of humor. Give me the grace to understand jokes so that I may know a little joy in life and communicate it and can communicate it to others. Amen. So Francis asks for a good humor, for happiness may inhabit him, so that he may be able to pass that on to others. And happiness is a gift that we can try to pass on to others. It's also a divine attribute that we can leverage to make life have meaning. It sets us in motion and it helps us tackle difficult situations and help and soften difficult situations in ourselves. And it's to be able to laugh and make fun of ourselves. And it's good to take us outside from those difficult situations that we may face. And I think that has a lot to do with lightness too. My burden is light. That's what Jesus said. So how often is our life so heavy because of a perspective that our ego brings us, for this lack of trust on the idea that there is a law that governs the entire universe, and that law is one of love, one that is connective of people, and has this eye of a child. And if we have the right environment, they have this natural happiness, the natural lightness about them. And I think that's it. I think these are the reflections that we bring today.
Então, obrigado, Marluce, obrigado, Cláudia.
So thank you, Marluce, and thank you,
A gente não vai
Claudia.
fazer as perguntas e respostas por causa do tempo.
We won't
Então, eu
do
gostaria de perguntar
questions
a
and answers
vocês se
because of
vocês
our
têm
time,
alguma
but I
consideração
wanted
final
to
que
ask
vocês
you if there are
gostariam
any
de
final
compartilhar
comments or
com
remarks that you'd
seguinte,
like
fechando o
to
estudo.
share with the group before we close our evening.
Olha, eu, como consideração final, eu acho que eu deixaria
As a
assim,
final
que
consideration,
eu acho que eu sou péssima para lembrar as fontes, mas eu
I
acho que
don't
foi
remember
o
sources
Dalai
very
Lama
well,
que falou,
but I think it was
se
Dalai
tivéssemos
Lama who
salvado,
said
discurso,
that if
livro,
he had to
salvaria as
save
bem-aventuranças de Jesus,
one book,
que
one
nós
part of the
saberíamos,
gospel,
ali estariam todos os
it
ensinamentos
was the
que nós precisamos
Beatitudes.
para a nossa vida. Então,
That it
que
will
a
be all
gente
the
possa
teachings
se
that we needed for our
aproximar
life.
desse psicólogo Jesus.
So may we
Com o
approach this
coração, e
great
quando
psychologist
deixar, né, nos imaginarmos assim, nessa imagem que a Cláudia trouxe de Jesus sentado
and
no monte,
imagine this
nós,
image
como
that Claudia brought
crianças
to
em
us, that
volta, né, sendo
Jesus sitting in this mount and us as
agraciados,
children
né? Então,
just
eu
being
acho que é
bathed by
um
these
manancial
words.
imenso, assim, de
And this is a
sabedoria para
great
nós, e que aos
source of
poucos a gente
wisdom
vai conseguindo
that little by
compreender.
little we may be able to better understand.
Nos aproximarmos de Jesus é tão importante,
And for
Angelis.
us to get
Eu me lembro de uma
closer
fala
to
do
Jesus is
Paulo
very
num
important.
congresso que
I
teve
remember
aqui
a
no
talk
Rio, antes
that
da pandemia.
Devaldo
E ele
offered us
disse:
before the
falem de
pandemia. And he
Jesus.
says,
Falem de
speak of Jesus.
O mundo precisa escutar Jesus.
The world
Se
needs to
aproximar de
listen
Jesus. Então nós precisamos
and to get closer to
ler,
Jesus. And we need to speak
sobre ele,
of him, to read about him,
absorver a
to
paz que
drink
traz
the
esse
peace that he brought us,
E
his
nós trouxemos que
teachings.
as bem-aventuranças podem ser uma
And we
oração.
brought that the
que nós
Beatitudes could be a
possamos
prayer.
meditar em
May we
cada
be able
fala,
to
cada
meditate in
palavra
each
sobre
sentence and
Jesus.
each one of these
Porque as
Beatitudes.
respostas estão todas dentro de
So,
nós. Os
because all
caminhos
of
estão
these
dentro de nós.
concepts are within us, our path is within us.
É isso.
And I think that's it.
Né, Cláudia? Agradecer a oportunidade de estar aqui.
And just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with everybody. For us to be able to get closer to the Beatitudes and spend some time studying this.
Thank you very much, Marluce, Claudia, and Dan, for another beautiful study. I also want to send best wishes to everyone who joined us tonight or who will be viewing the record later on. I hope you can all join us on our next meeting for our next study on Spiritism viewed through transpersonal psychology, when Tiago and Mariani will lead our study on reincarnation and unconsciousness and forgetting the past. I wish you all a very good evening and see you soon. Bye for now.